it's rusted. Well, as expected. It was a flyby. September 26th, and the last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet was damaged. A Ukrainian surface drone is attacking Novorossiysk. The Crimean bridge has been closed. Air defense bases in Crimea have been blown up.
It's listing heavily.
It's going down here. Look, what a huge ship. Air defense bases in Crimea have been blown up. Attacks have begun on the Northern Pacific and Black Sea fleets of Russia. Air defense bases in Crimea have been blown up. The SBU and special forces are attacking military airfields, nuclear submarines, and the Russian Navy. Everything is burning. On August 28th, warfighters struck a Kaliber missile carrier in the Sea of Azov. A Buyan M-class missile ship was damaged. Not a single Russian naval fleet can effectively hide from the advanced Maloika sea drones, which are operated by the SBU. We'll discuss all this with military analyst Roman Sviatan right now. Friends, air defense and our special services are attacking Russian military targets. The most interesting news is that the last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet has been damaged. A source from the main intelligence directorate claims that the Russian Black Sea Fleet has only one submarine left. The Kolpino was the only submarine capable of carrying out combat missions. And now, according to information from the main intelligence directorate, it has been damaged. A military airfield was attacked. Last night, the new Butolina base in Kaifa was also hit. And the 899th Guards Assault Aviation Arshan Regiment as well. For several days in a row, military factories in Russia have been under attack. This time, the Tambov gunpowder plant in the city of Kotovsk was targeted. Damn, I can't keep up. Everything's on fire. Maybe it's the factory? The factory. Take a look, what's going on there? We're screwed. Last night, there was also a permanent deployment point for Russian militants in Maria, in the Kursk region. There was a permanent deployment point for one of the Russian airborne forces units, about a company in size. The SBU and special services are preparing attacks on the Pacific Fleet and the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation. In Washington, Kots wrote an article saying that the SBU and Ukrainian special services will continue special operations. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Sviatan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. I wish you good health.
Important information about the Black Sea Fleet submarine Kolpino, which for some reason is now damaged. This is reported by VCHK-GPU.
Russia has only 3 submarines left in the Black Sea, so-called launchers, which can launch Kaliber missiles from underwater. But if it is damaged, there really is some damage. Why? Because the General Staff has not yet confirmed it. That's why right now we're talking based on information from a Telegram channel. Once the General Staff confirms it, then we can say that as a minus, 1 more Kaliber carrier can be counted as lost. But damaging a submarine in principle is possible in various ways. If it's reconnaissance, then it means either informants or external influence. That is, with the help of beacons, with the help of underwater torpedo devices. We have so-called underwater drones like the Taloka and the Morichka, which carry out combat missions. And of course, there's also the possibility of acting at the places where they surface. That is, submarines approach places like Novorossiysk, where they have specific docks and technical services, and damage could be inflicted there as well. That's why for us, damaging submarines is very important, because at the moment we can't really track them properly in the Black Sea. In other words, while we can see Russian surface ships well, if a submarine dives deep, it's very difficult to detect. Possible in principle, but it would require an entire operation, including aviation, by the way, to use special hydro buoys and other means to locate the sub. Sinking it is also very difficult, so the best option is to damage it while it's on the surface, and even better, in the Novorossiysk area. Why has Novorossiysk been waiting for our army to take action for so long? The intelligence services seem to have forgotten about the Novorossiysk direction, most likely because there's an oil terminal nearby, and right now the intelligence services are as afraid of anything related to Russian oil as they are of fire. In other words, Ukrainian intelligence services are quicker to steer clear of anything related to oil than the Russians themselves. So now, of course, the question is for our army. That is, our armed forces of Ukraine are not as tightly tied to certain power structures as the intelligence services are. They mostly serve those interests. Whereas the army is carrying out combat missions and understands for itself that if, for example, it doesn't destroy Russian submarines in Novorossiysk, even if that means hitting the Novorossiysk oil terminal as well, then eventually they themselves will end up dying. The intelligence services don't die. It's the soldiers on the front line who die, while the intelligence services, instead of destroying the hydrocarbon infrastructure under the sanctions of Maliuk and Budanov, just throw up their hands and say, oh, we couldn't do it, and so on and so forth. That's why the army now has to take on this issue, destroying Russian hydrocarbon infrastructure, including the bases of Russian submarine forces. There are just too many questions. They are not fulfilling their direct official duties. Destroying Russian military facilities is the main task of the armed forces of Ukraine. To be honest, for the army, this is now the main task for Magyar. Specifically using long-range strike capabilities, mainly drones, to destroy, including the enemy's rear positions. The special services should be dealing with internal problems, and we have more than enough of those. They received a command not to strike at Russian oil and gas facilities. Of course, we are very grateful that they once lent a helping hand to the armed forces of Ukraine, but in the end, we need to focus on internal enemies and internal issues. This is regarding the special services. Magyar, believe me, will handle it. I think Magyar will send them in the direction of the Russian warship. Anyone who is told not to strike at military targets will be sent there as well. For example, the oil and gas sector and Russia itself are such internal issues. It's clear that they'll come up with something for the 12th offer congratulations, but right now, after the special services have shown themselves in a very bad light, really a very bad light, because they did not fulfill their direct official duties, did not arrest those in contact with the Russians, did not arrest the one who gave the order not to strike at Russian oil refineries. In other words, they did not accomplish their task. Let the special services deal with the army, because this time they've already shifted into the mode of the Ministry of Internal Affairs that is closer to that old Soviet school. So at least now let the armed forces of Ukraine do their job. All the more so, it's long past time for the special services to, let's put it mildly, reorient themselves. The main intelligence directorate should not be subordinate to the Minister of Defense, and even less so to civilians. The main intelligence directorate should be subordinate to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and within it should be the same special operations forces. In other words, it's a unified system, and there they should be focused on destroying Russian military targets, including the oil refining sector. The security service of Ukraine also should no longer exist. Why? Because, for example, engaging in political investigations for those in power, the so-called elites, we don't need that. This is a democratic country, after all, a European one, so all these KGB-style habits need to be completely eliminated. Those habits, I mean, and the SBU political investigators who are freed up should be sent to the armed forces of Ukraine as infantry. That would be the optimal solution. The only structure that should really remain is counterintelligence. But again, counterintelligence should be placed under the general staff. That is, it should be subordinated to the armed forces of Ukraine, and this will be the main intelligence directorate, which will include counterintelligence as part of it. That's it. We shouldn't have any more agencies. There shouldn't be an SBU. It simply shouldn't exist. The army should be focused on combat tasks, that is, systematic work to destroy the Russian military economy and Russian military facilities. This is the optimal solution for us. Right now, we can't afford to support intelligence agencies that, to put it mildly, aren't even catching mice inside the country, unlike us.
Roman Igorovich, the Buterlinovka airfield has been attacked. The 899th Guards Assault Aviation Regiment, Arshan Regiment. There have been explosions, there is damage. Let's discuss this.
Well, it's an assault regiment, so there are Su aircraft stationed there. Russian Su aircraft, a large number of them. We've hit Buterlinovka several times, but we haven't completely put it out of action. Well, in principle, to completely put any airfield out of action, for example, is difficult. It's practically impossible to disable an airfield unless you have the capability to approach closely, for example, with bombers dropping free-fall bombs, mainly bunker busters. Those are pretty effective bomb strikes. If that's not possible, then at most you can damage, especially if you're using drones, the airfield's technical equipment and any vehicles present, including Russian aircraft. I thought that within a couple of days, the general staff, after decoding the operational control data and analyzing the same satellite images obtained by our intelligence, would report the actual losses. But Butulinovka is one of the tactical aviation airfields that will be destroyed if possible at the very least. The only thing is, of course, now they realize that we are starting to reach even such distances and they will begin to disperse their tactical aviation. What do we mean by tactical aviation?
Roman Igorovich, we've just turned our attention to the systematic attacks on military airfields. In general, over just the past 15 days, targets of Russia's military-industrial complex have included 1 military space reconnaissance unit, 3 airfields, 13 enterprises connected to the defense industry, with an additional 4 attacked again within the month, and 3 more airfields with a focus on chemical plants and ammunition production. How do you assess this work? Is there anything in particular that you would highlight from the past 2 weeks?
And here we can truly and wholeheartedly praise our incredibly dedicated army, because the vast majority of these impactful strikes are indeed the direct and effective work of our courageous military, specifically the highly capable armed forces of Ukraine. Mainly it's them, meaning the specialized drone units, the formidable air force responsible for crucial actions against the enemy navy. So they each have their own absolutely vital and distinct role in this ongoing and critical regard. Right now, as Modiar has clearly demonstrated, there is excellent management of the drone systems, meaning there is a certain amount of work happening within the command system itself. This is all precisely the systematic work of the army, which is targeting military facilities. And here, the key word is systematic work. Why? Because when it comes to special services, they swoop in, peck at something, move on, peck a bit more, show off, and then move on again. But the army, if it gets involved, does it slowly. Slowly, we come down from the mountain and take the whole Russian herd. That's how armies operate. And that's why it's optimal when you have fully formed armed forces. No one else can do it better than them. Within the armed forces, there should be their own special services, which must carry out combat missions according to the combat charter and the oath that servicemen and officers at the very least give to the people of Ukraine, and not listen to politicians who tie the hands of the special services. But the special services, like little dogs, run errands and solve the politicians' problems. That's not how the army works. The army can clean itself out thoroughly from top to bottom and even twist the heads off those politicians who work against it. So this was exactly a clear operation. The destruction of powder plants, the destruction of airfields, aircraft airfields, the destruction of production facilities, especially electronics. So in just a couple of weeks, we've talked about almost a dozen and a half, practically every other day, about a dozen and a half major significant Russian targets were destroyed. The only thing left now is to keep going, but forget about Maluk and Budanov's sanctions. And both Maluk and Budanov themselves, and about sanctions, they've already done their work on the oil refineries. Now we need to continue destroying Russia's hydrocarbon sector using the means of unmanned systems. This opportunity exists, and Madiar needs to prove himself. If even Madiar chickens out like the intelligence services did, then I guess it'll be up to us old guys to take care of this issue. Call up our friends and just burn down Russia's hydrocarbon industry from the inside, so to speak, from within Russia itself.
Dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine and let us know where you're watching from. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why every like, every comment, and every subscription from you is priceless. I'm grateful to you for this. Roman Grigorievich, last night, and actually for several days in a row, we have been attacking military factories in Russia. And right now, the Tambov gunpowder plant in the city of Kotovsk is under attack. What have we analyzed? So, the Tambov gunpowder plant produces nitrocellulose powders for all types of small arms and artillery weapons, including systems of various calibers used by ground forces, the Navy, and aviation. It is also the main supplier of armor-piercing subcaliber rounds for tank artillery. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
Any gunpowder plant is very difficult to hit and completely put out of commission. At least it's practically impossible to do so with drones. So the fact that we managed to hit the Tambov gunpowder plant today, well, it's good that we hit it. But in reality, we didn't inflict any significant damage. Why? Because some of the workshops are underground. Any gunpowder plant, when it was designed back in the Soviet Union, was supposed to withstand a nuclear strike. How is any drone supposed to reach it? The only thing that can actually hit a gunpowder plant is a warhead of about half a ton, a tandem one, meaning it would have to break through the underground interior, get to the place where the gunpowder is actually produced, and detonate there. This is only possible with the use of either cruise missiles with a very long range, and at the moment we don't have any of those. Even if we talk about the Taurus Storm Shadow or Scalp level, well, Scalp has a range of 250 kilometers and Taurus has 500 kilometers. Well, we won't be able to reach all the factories, and most of the Russian gunpowder factories are over there, closer to the Urals. That's already nearly 2,000 kilometers away. Right now, what's really important for us is ballistics. In other words, we need a ballistic missile program, and if it hasn't been launched yet, then the executive branch, which has been sitting there for 7 years and still hasn't started it, needs to be kicked into gear. Ballistics isn't about hitting targets 50 or 100 kilometers away like the Tochka U or even the HIMARS with their M30 and M31 rockets do now. It's about reaching 2,500 kilometers all the way to the Ural. That's where we need to reach. These are serious ballistic programs that were destroyed back in the day during Poroshenko's time and then buried even deeper by the current government. So at this point, it's been 7 years that the executive branch has been in power, and we still don't have a single ballistic missile. Meanwhile, during this time, the Saudis used our facilities and their own money to produce the Chrome missiles and took them for themselves. So the capability exists, which means there was simply no will and no funding allocated for these programs. And this, in its purest form during hostilities, is Article 111, state treason. Why are all these people still not behind bars? Again, these are questions for the security services who are busy with God knows what, but not their actual job. So this is a major problem for us right now. But I think the security services will listen to us and finally start doing their job by identifying the shortcomings in the planned production of the ballistic program. Why? Because without ballistics, we definitely won't win this war. And what's more, the best and most interesting air defense for us right now is ballistic missiles, strange as that may sound. Because any strike on our territory, if we respond with a ballistic missile aimed at Moscow, at the Kremlin, and it's only 500 kilometers, we don't even need to reach the Urals. It's just 500 kilometers. How much is that? 5 to 10 minutes of flight time, basically, for a ballistic missile. And this was the optimal option, but all our authorities have simply ruined it in recent time. In other words, they didn't allow the possibility of striking Moscow in response to attacks on Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, on Ukraine, basically. So there is a big question here. I'll repeat that once again. Well, as for the intelligence services, of course, there are no questions for them. They should be sent to the Ukrainian armed forces. That's already a lost cause. They're useless. But the question is for the executive branch, because if we don't replace the executive branch now, we'll never have ballistic missiles at all. And we'll fight to the last Ukrainian if we don't strike Moscow and don't destroy Russia's hydrocarbon. The best sanction is precisely the direct destruction of Russian oil refineries, Russian terminals, and Russia's gas and oil extraction industry. So this approach should be important because here's a good point. Here we are talking about it. Yes, we reached Tambo. Yes, we set off some kind of fireworks there. But did we destroy the plant? No. Then what was the point of doing all this at all? Why did we simply waste drones that made it there? Lost a ton of drones and decoys on the way to Tambov. So why? Maybe it would have been easier to just hit Novoshakhtinsk, the Russian oil refinery in Novoshakhtinsk that specifically supplies diesel, gasoline, and aviation kerosene to the Russian army. This question, that's what you call showing off. This kind of showing off, nobody needs it anymore at this point. Either this government will work specifically for Ukraine's victory, or it will end up going the same way as the previous Yanukovych government. They're sitting there comfortably in Moscow, bad-mouthing each other. So Yanukovych probably dragged some of them along with him to Barvika or wherever they're staying. In other words, they can't do it. You can't do it. And I'm addressing the executive branch now. If you can't do it, then clear the way, for heaven's sake. If you don't have the brains to accomplish certain tasks, to set them, oversee them, and deliver what we need, then clear the way and let people who actually understand these issues take over. Why is that? Because if not, we'll all end up badly, not just those in power. The authorities, of course, will grab their ill-gotten, their property acquired through backbreaking labor and scatter in all directions. Ukraine will be lost and Ukrainians will be lost, because in this kind of situation, if we don't strike where we need to strike, then we simply won't exist anymore. We'll just wear ourselves down in this sense. And the blame for this will lie with the executive authorities, who will scatter in all directions. So the question now is for the authorities, specifically for those people who are directly responsible for these issues. Well, as for Tambov getting a little scorched there, well, that's just, as they say, scaring the crows. Well, at least for now. There were strikes before this. We talked about this with you before. There was a good strike on the fuel and lubricants depot in Engels. Almost the entire depot burned down. The only thing left there is an underground reservoir and underground storage. There are still several tens of thousands of tons of fuel, aviation kerosene, in these so-called Russian depots. That's what needs to be reached. But again, you can only get to it either with intelligence service confidence or with ballistic missiles, because in those karst caves, you just can't reach those kaisans any other way. Although, of course, you can always try.
Roman Grigorievich, when we attacked the Iskander ballistic missile launchers in Bryansk, afterwards I read that many military analysts wrote, and there were even video materials saying that in this way Ukraine was testing or trying out our ballistic missiles, that a number of airfields were attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. These were tests, and among other things, these launchers could have been attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. What is your opinion on this kind of information?
It's complete nonsense. I'll explain why now. For several weeks, we've been tearing into this executive branch left and right with six-story curses, because in the seventh year, they still don't have any ballistic missiles. And most likely, they just threw this into the information space to say, no, we did something here ourselves. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So what is Klintsy? It's 50 kilometers from our border. What kind of ballistic missile do we need for that? Klintsy is 50 kilometers away, and an M31 rocket launched from a HIMARS can reach there. Ballistics, well, you could say that's ballistics. No questions there. But what we need is a ballistic missile with a range of 500 kilometers to reach Moscow and a warhead of half a ton, not the kind of warhead that exploded in Klintsy. We all saw the information flow about that. There was no more than 50 kilograms of explosives there. So that's about a 90-kilogram warhead, the so-called M31 missile. What about our own ballistic missiles? Well, if you consider that HIMARS, are ours, and the M31 missiles are already ours if we've paid for them, then sure, no problem. That's our ballistics, just manufactured in America. That's why there are serious questions for the executive branch, especially when they try to pull the wool over our eyes, claiming they've already tested something somewhere. If they had really tested a true ballistic missile, at least in the way I'm describing, a half-ton warhead with a 500-kilometer range, then Moscow would already be burning. We would have already seen it. Lenin himself would be running around Red Square in shock in his underwear and a t-shirt shouting, "What are you doing? Have you lost your minds?" But obviously, that's not happening. Then there's all this nonsense, this executive branch of ours claiming that they're testing something somewhere. They could just as well be testing something in their own bathtub, doing who knows what. That's all they're capable of, nothing more. It's obvious. They're complete impotents.
Roman Grigorievich, the permanent base of Russian militants in Mariino-Kursk region was attacked. According to military analysts, a permanent deployment point of one of the Russian airborne forces units is or was located there with a considerable number of personnel. We're expecting good news in the General Staff's report. What do you think?
Well, the permanent bases of Russian paratroopers. Right now, by the way, there are some serious battles going on in Tetkino. Mostly it's either Crimean paratroopers or those from Ivanovo stationed there. So basically, they took all the men from Ivanovo, the city of brides, and told them, "Yeah, you'll be paratroopers." Well, all the girls from Ivanovo have already joined the LGBT community. What else are they supposed to do if all the men? So naturally, the permanent base, which is not far from Tetkino, that's Risk. And as we've often talked about strikes, it's mostly Risk. Lviv is on the right bank of the Seam. They're operating there. They've worked in Marinovka as well. It's the same story. Recently, a bridge, just last night, a bridge was taken out not far from Tetkino. So there's serious work going on there, army-level operations to destroy the enemy's rear positions. This is what they call the army's rear area. So either permanent bases or headquarters, command and control systems are being identified and tracked. Moreover, you can clearly see systematic work being done in the Kursk direction right now. All branches and types of troops are involved, except maybe the Navy. Although if there are Marines there, then most likely the Navy is involved as well. So all branches of the military are specifically operating in the Kursk direction. And this systematic approach is producing results. Starting from the destruction of command posts with a large number of Russians killed, they recently took down a Russian Su-35. We talked about this not long ago, so they eliminated it as well. And that was also in this direction. This is, so to speak, the full range of combat tasks being carried out by the armed forces of Ukraine. You could say that the summer of 2025 is becoming a formative summer. The Ukrainian army in its entirety. Now it's complete. Well, the only thing we don't have at the moment, the only thing is space capabilities. That is, we don't have so-called space forces. Although I think we'll get to that in due time as well, because we have practically everything else, from submarines to aviation.
Kirill Budanov stated that the cooperation between Russia and North Korea is already having a direct impact on the war in Ukraine. In particular, the head of the GUR emphasized that Pyongyang is actively supplying Moscow with weapons and MLRS artillery systems. As an example of such cooperation, Budanov cited the North Korean ballistic missiles, KN-23 or HN-23. He noted that the first batch of these missiles used against Ukraine was of extremely poor quality. Almost half exploded in the air or veered significantly off target. However, thanks to the help of the Russians, these missiles have been greatly improved. This is a direct result of the joint work of specialists from both regimes. And accordingly, this is causing great concern, Budanov said. Roman Hrihorovich, please.
Budanov is absolutely right. At first, the task for the KN-23, which is a Korean missile, was simply to hit the planet, but they couldn't even manage that. The missiles exploded in the air. They couldn't even hit the planet. And then, when they started bringing these missiles into our theater of military operations, most likely Chinese and Russian engineers got involved, refined the missile, and now it's on par with, or even slightly surpasses, the Iskander. It can go, I believe, up to 200 kilometers farther than the Iskander, up to 700 kilometers. Some of its variants even have a warhead that's 150 kilograms heavier. So basically, the missile has become quite dangerous at this point after skilled specialists got involved in its production. They only got involved in the production of this missile a few months ago, or, well, let's say last year. Meanwhile, our authorities have been sitting around for 7 years and still can't create this missile, especially considering that we had already created it before, at least to recreate it. That is even the same Grom 2, which we had and handed over to the Saudis. So they can't even manage that. Look at the North Korean donuts. They don't finish eating them, probably because they all go to Kim Jong-il since he's about to burst. But in reality, of course, they can't do it. They don't participate in the world economy. They're completely cut off by sanctions. Yet, nevertheless, they have ballistic missiles capable of reaching, if we had them, Moscow. And that's 700 kilos. Moscow is 450 kilometers away. And these are about 600 or 700 kilometers. So they managed to do it. So the North Korean donut was able to make these missiles, but our Minister of Defense, our donut, couldn't make these missiles. I mean, they're basically the same. One is just a bit wider than the other, but one has missiles and we don't. That's a big problem. That's why Budanov is right in this sense, in the sense that he provides accurate information. Yeah, but what's the use of it, of this information? This information doesn't really make things better or worse for us. If Budanov were saying right now that the missile production in North Korea had been destroyed, now that would have been something, that would have been a real result. So the issue isn't about Budanov, it's about a systemic error, our systemic error in building up the armed forces. It shouldn't be like this, where we have about a dozen security agencies, a dozen of them, and they're all just drifting around, each doing their own thing. During wartime, everyone should be under a single command. The GUR should be under the command not of our Ponchik, but under the chief of the general staff. It should ultimately be under Gnatov's command. And then we won't be listening to or even hearing Budanov at all. Frankly, we shouldn't be hearing from him at all. Tell me, please, who is the head of the GRU of the Russian general staff? No one knows who he is. Why is your information supposed to be classified, but you hear Budanov everywhere? That's just not the way, that's not the intelligence way. That is, they are supposed to carry out combat missions. That's it. And by the way, why do the Russians have the GRU of the General Staff, the main intelligence directorate of the General Staff, while we have the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense? Do you think they have idiots sitting over there? But here we've created a certain structure just to siphon off money and drift around aimlessly. That's what it's called. The GUR should be placed under the General Staff, under the Chief of the General Staff, currently under Hnatov. He'll quickly get their heads straight and assign them where they need to go and what they need to do. It's the same story with the security service, as I've already mentioned. Counterintelligence should go to the GUR and the Chief of the General Staff, and everyone else should be integrated into the armed forces of Ukraine. We don't need political surveillance in a democratic country. They run around with folders, making files on everyone, who said what, who gave a dirty look to these office rats, and so on and so forth. That's their problem. At the very least, they're getting involved in things that aren't their business. But when it comes to North Korea, concrete decisions need to be made right now. It's not far away, really not far at all. Limit North Korea and Ukraine. Don't be shocked right now. The Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic borders North Korea along the Tonkaya and Tumanaya rivers. The Tumanaya River. That's why this issue needs to be addressed exactly where, for example, our intelligence should be working. Specifically, the re-establishment of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic and engaging in combat operations with the North Korean donut along the Tumanaya River. This should be our objective. We'll see, because anything can happen. Recently, the North Koreans had a ship land in the wrong place. Well, ships don't just fall for no reason. That's something to think about too.
Dear audience, as always, please give this video a like. Write a few kind words in the comments to support the armed forces of Ukraine as well as Ukraine itself. We work for an audience all over the world so that they know the truth about Russian aggression. That's why every like, every subscription and every comment from you is invaluable. I will be grateful to you for all of this. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitin, we work 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much.